Hi, welcome to the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. Time for a look at a real classic. And this is a book that came out in 1998. That's hard to believe. 25 plus years. That's Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ. And of course, this launched a whole series of the Case for books that Strobel has done. What a simple idea. Go around and talk to people who are experts in the field, ask them questions, challenge them, and put down the results. So it's like having a whole bunch of well-known scholars in your home. Now, I did two previous podcasts on this. One was Circumstantial Evidence for the Resurrection. That was chapter 14 of the book. And chapter 1, which is Can We Trust the Gospels as Biography? And I thought I'd go along with that right now and just pick up chapter 2. It's the same person that he's interviewing. That's Craig Blomberg. He's really considered a foremost authority on the biographies of Jesus, the four Gospels. He's just a great background, part of a lead group that produced a series of acclaimed works on Jesus. He's been a professor of New Testament at Denver Seminary, all sorts of good books, which actually I've used in these podcasts as well. So the first chapter was eyewitness evidence. Can we see the Gospels as eyewitness? But chapter 2 goes along with that, and it's testing the eyewitness evidence. So it says he wants to take Dr. Blomberg and either reveal strengths or weaknesses in the way to test the Gospels. And he says to Blomberg, this is Lee Strobel talking, there are 8 different tests that he wants to ask him about. So here's test number 1. Now, was it the stated or implied intention of the writers to accurately preserve history? That's called the intention test. So you could trust a written account if they felt that the writers were trying to preserve real history. And Blomberg says, yes, they were. The first century writers were interested in recording what actually happened. He said, take a look at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. He said, that sounds like other trusted historical and biographical works of antiquity. And of course, here's the opening that Blomberg is talking about. This is from Luke. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. So Blomberg points out Luke is clearly saying he was trying to be accurate about what he had investigated and what he found to be well supported by witnesses. So Strobel says, well, what about other Gospels? They don't seem to have the same declaration. Does that mean maybe their writers didn't have that same intention of trying to be truthful? Then Blomberg says, well, it's true. Matthew and Mark don't have that kind of explicit statement, but they are writing in the same genre, the same style, and the same type of writing. And it says, it seems reasonable that Luke's historical intent would closely mirror theirs. Then he said, look at John. That's the question Strobel has. Said, what about that one? And says, sounds more like a theological statement in John 20. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. Says that sounds more like theology than history. And Blomberg says, well, I'll grant you that. But he says, if you're going to be convinced enough to believe, the theology has to come from history. That makes sense, doesn't it? Why would you believe something if it came from inaccurate sources? He said, consider the way the Gospels are written. This is Blomberg talking now. They're sober. They seem responsible. They put in incidental details that you don't really need to seem accurate because they're done with care and exactitude. He said, you don't find outlandish flourishes, for example, or blatant mythologizing that you see in other ancient writings. He said it seems pretty apparent to him, Blomberg, that the goal of the gospel writers was to try to record what had actually occurred. Well, is that what really happened? Strobel says. There's a contradictory scenario that some critics have brought up. Here it is. Some say, well, the early Christians were convinced Jesus was going to return in their lifetime, so they didn't think it was necessary to preserve any historical records. Why bother to do all that if he's going to come right back and end the world and end everything at any moment? So Strobel says years later, it became obvious by that point Jesus wasn't coming back right away, and then they didn't have any accurate historical material. Nothing had been captured. Is that what really happened? Now it says that's not true for early Christianity, says Blomberg. Well, why not, says Strobel. What was so different about Christianity? And Blomberg says, well, first, the premise is a little overstated. It says the majority of Jesus' teachings do suppose that there'll be a significant span of time before the end of the world. He says, but even if some of Jesus' followers thought he might come back quickly, remember, says Blomberg, Christianity came out of Judaism. And for 8 centuries, the Jews lived with that tension between these repeated pronouncements from their prophets that the day of the Lord was at hand, but there's also this continuing history of Israel. And yet the followers recorded, they valued, they preserved the words of the prophets. And says Jesus' followers saw him as greater than a prophet, so they would have done the same thing. Well, then Strobel says, well, some scholars have raised another objection. They say that early Christians frequently believed that the physically departed Jesus was speaking to them, or through them, with messages or prophecies for their church. And so, since these prophecies were, they saw them as authoritative as Jesus' own words when he was alive on earth, the early Christians didn't distinguish between those newer sayings and the original words of the historical Jesus. So the Gospels ended up blending these two together, so we really don't know what goes back to the historical Jesus and what doesn't. How do you respond to that? And Blomberg says that has less historical support than the previous statement. Within the New Testament itself, so there's evidence that disproves this. He said there are occasions where early Christian prophecy is referred to, but it's always distinguished from what the Lord has said. Now, what's an example of that? Well, Blomberg talks about 1 Corinthians 7. Paul clearly distinguishes when he has a word from the Lord and when he's quoting the historical Jesus. He said, look at the book of Revelation. You can distinguish the handful of times in which Jesus directly speaks to this prophet, John the Apostle, and when John is recounting his own inspired visions. And in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul is talking about what's the criteria for true prophecy. He says the local church has a responsibility to test the prophets. But he says, the strongest argument is what we never find in the Gospels. When Jesus ascended, there were some controversies that threatened the early church. For example, do you need to circumcise the believers? What about speaking in tongues? How do you keep Jews and Gentiles united? What are the roles for women in ministry? Should believers be allowed to divorce non-Christian spouses? And Blomberg says these kinds of issues could have been conveniently resolved if the early Christians had just simply read back into the Gospels what Jesus had told them from the world beyond. In other words, Jesus was gone 30 or 40 years, the church gets set up, people have controversies in the church. Why didn't they just say, yea, verily, this is what Jesus said? I said, that never happened. So it said the continuance of these controversies showed that Christians were distinguishing what happened during Jesus' lifetime and what was debated later in the churches. Okay, so all of that is first point. That's called the intention test. Was it the stated or implied intention of the writers to accurately preserve history? Yes. How about number 2? This is called the ability test. Even if the writers did want to record history reliably, were they able to do so? In other words, how are we sure that the material about Jesus' life and teachings were preserved for 30 years or so before finally written down in the Gospels? That's a pretty big gap of time. I don't know about you. I can't remember day before yesterday. And we're supposed to believe that the disciples and the followers of Jesus were able to keep in their heads 30 years worth of, for 30 years, the material that Jesus said. And Strobel says to Blomberg, well, what about faulty memories or wishful thinking and the development of legend? Wouldn't that mess up everything? But I thought this was good. Blomberg says, but we're in a foreign land, in a distant time and place, and a culture that didn't have a printing press, didn't have computers, books, even scrolls of papyrus at that time. They were rare. So what'd you do? You learned your education, your worship, how to teach in a religious community done by word of mouth. So there were many cases of rabbis so famous. Why? They had the entire Old Testament committed to memory. That just boggles my mind. I mean, I can't do a single chapter, much less a book of the Old Testament, and they had rabbis that memorized the entire Old Testament. So Blomberg said it would be very easy for Jesus' disciples to commit much more to memory than what was in the four Gospels and to pass it along accurately. And Strobel says, well, wait a minute. Who does that kind of memorization? How's that possible? And Blomberg said, yeah, it does seem hard to imagine, but it was an oral culture. I said, you have to remember that 80 to 90% of what Jesus said was in a poetic form. Not rhyming, but it had a meter, it had balanced lines, it had parallelism and so forth. Then I always think of ask, seek, and knock, right? So Jesus says things in three different ways. His parables are pretty easy to remember because they're so visual. So anyway, back to Blomberg. He said, also, the definition of memorization was more flexible back then. You had freedom to vary how much of the story was told on any occasion. In other words, you could include parts, you could leave some out, you could paraphrase. He said in the ancient Middle East, anywhere from something like 10 to 40% of any story in sacred tradition could vary from one occasion to the next. But there were always fixed points that were unalterable. And the community that was being told these stories had the right to intervene and correct the storyteller if they got it wrong. So Blomberg says it's interesting, 10 to 40% is pretty consistently the amount of variation among the synoptic gospels on any given passage. So Strobel tries to pop in here to say, well, what are we talking about? And so Blomberg says a lot of the similarities and differences among the three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, could be explained by assuming the disciples and the other early Christians had committed to memory a lot of what Jesus said and did, but they felt free to give us that information in various forms. They produced the significance of his teachings, but not word for word. So I thought that was interesting. So let's move on. Here's a third way to test the eyewitness evidence. It's called the character test. Was it in the character of these writers to be truthful? I mean, was there any evidence of dishonesty that might taint their ability? And Blomberg shook his head, no. We don't have any reason to suggest they were anything but people of great integrity. I mean, he says they reported the words and actions of a man who called them to an exacting level of integrity, more so than probably any religion has ever known. They were willing to live out those beliefs, even to the point of death. And Blomberg estimates 10 of the 11 remaining disciples were put to grisly deaths. So he says we can trust them because of their character. Okay, here's a fourth way to test eyewitnesses. It's called consistency. And Strobel says, well, aren't they hopelessly contradictory? Aren't there all these discrepancies in the gospel accounts? And Blomberg said, yeah, there are points at which they appear to disagree. He says sometimes it's a minor variation in wording, and some look like apparent contradictions. But he says, let's go back. If you allow for the things that he already talked about, like paraphrasing, abridging sometimes, of adding some explanations, of omitting parts, of selecting certain parts, he said the Gospels are extremely consistent with each other by ancient standards. He said that's the only way that we should be judging them. That's the fair way to judge them. In fact, if the Gospels have been identical to each other, this is what J. Warner Wallace points out. He was a cold case detective. If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John told every story exactly the same, it said that would have raised a lot of controversy and a lot of charges that they conspired to coordinate their stories in advance. So if they're too consistent, it doesn't make them look like independent witnesses. There's a comment here at this point that Strobel brings in. Simon Greenleaf of Harvard Law School, he was a legal figure and wrote an influential treatise on evidence. He looked at the four gospel writers, and here's what Greenleaf had to say. There's enough of a discrepancy to show that there could have been no previous concert among them. In other words, getting together and getting their stories exact. And he says at the same time, such substantial agreement as to show they were all independent narrators of the same great transaction. I think that's interesting. He says a German scholar, Steyer is his last name, he concurs that actually to have some slight diversity of details suggests credibility. Fabricated accounts tend to be fully consistent and harmonized. Well, you know what's coming up at this point. We're talking about, are there contradictions? So Strobel says, well, what about this? Let's talk contradictions for a minute. In Matthew, it says a centurion himself came to ask Jesus to heal his servant. But Luke says the centurion sent his elders. Isn't that a contradiction? Blomberg says, I don't think so. In our world today, we may hear something like, the president today announced blah, blah, blah. But that speech was written by a speechwriter, maybe delivered by a press secretary. So nobody accuses the broadcast of being in error. And he said, in the ancient world, it was perfectly understood and accepted that actions were often attributed to people when in fact they occurred through subordinates or emissaries. So he said, all right. Strobel says, how about a second example? What about Mark and Luke said that Jesus sent the demons into the swine at Gerasa? And Matthew says they were sent in a place called Gadara. He said there's a contradiction. It's two different places. Blomberg says, well, wait a minute. One was a town and one was a province. Really? He says, there have been ruins of a town that have been excavated at the right point on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And it says the English pronounce it Cursa, but a Hebrew word translates it into Greek, and it would sound like Gerasa. So it may have been that place that was in the province of Gadara. Okay, says Strobel. What about this one? So we're going to a third possible contradiction. What about the genealogies, he asks, of Jesus? We get two different genealogies in Matthew and Luke. And Blomberg says multiple options. He said, here are the two most popular ones, two most popular options for how to interpret these two genealogies. One, Matthew reflects Joseph's lineage because the opening chapter is really told from Joseph's perspective, and he as the adoptive father would have been the legal ancestor that you'd trace his royal lineage through. So Luke then would trace the genealogy through Mary. And since both are from the ancestry of David, once you get back that far, the lines converge. Okay, so I've heard that one before, that one is tracing Joseph's line, the other is tracing Mary's line. But I guess there's a second option. I didn't know about this one. It says the second option, this is Blomberg again, that both genealogies reflect Joseph's lineage in order to create legalities. One is his human lineage, and the other is his legal lineage, with the two diverging at the points where someone in line did not have a direct offspring. They had to raise up legal heirs through various Old Testament practices. It says, then we got a problem because some of the names are omitted, which is accepted by the standards of the ancient world. It says, so we've got that. At least there's some possibilities at that point. I always think of the one which they didn't talk about, but I think about one gospel said there was one angel at the tomb, another one says there were two angels. But that's pretty easy to put together. The first one that says there was an angel, there was one angel, and there was another one probably nearby. So just because he doesn't mention the second one doesn't mean the second one wasn't there. Okay, so those are four of the accounts, and I think what I'll do is go kind of quickly over the other other 4 ways to test eyewitness evidence. One's called the bias test. Didn't the disciples, for example, have a vested interest in skewing that material about Jesus? He said they loved Jesus. They weren't neutral. Well, Blomberg says there is a potential for that, but he said people can honor and respect someone so much that they record his life with great integrity to show their love. He said, I think that's what's happened here. He said, besides, why would the disciples make up this stuff? What are they gaining? They got criticism, they got ostracism, they got martyrdom. They didn't win anything financially. They should have had pressure to keep quiet, to downplay Jesus. They didn't do it. Here's number 6, again, testing the eyewitness evidence. It's called the cover-up test. It says when you testify, sometimes you try to protect yourself by conveniently forgetting to mention details that are embarrassing. So Blomberg says, did the gospel writers include anything that might be embarrassing, or did they cover it up? And Blomberg said, well, think about the hard sayings of Jesus. If you're inventing a religion to suit your fancy, you probably wouldn't say, be as perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect, or to define adultery as lust in my heart. He says, take a look at Mark 6. Jesus, it says, there could do few miracles in Nazareth. Isn't that interesting that they're pointing out something embarrassing? About Jesus in Mark 13 says he doesn't know when he'll return. That seems to limit omniscience. So I thought that was interesting. Then what about the baptism? Why would Jesus doesn't have any sin? Why would he allow himself to be baptized? Why wouldn't they just leave that out? Or on the cross, Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, why? That sounds like Jesus is not sure what he's up to. So there's plenty of embarrassing material. How about Mark when he talks about Peter? It's pretty unflattering, and Peter's the ringleader. The disciples seem kind of dense. They don't understand Jesus at all. They look like a bunch of self-serving, self-seeking, dull-witted people. Yeah, so why would you put that kind of stuff in? Only if it was true. Here's test number 7. Again, how do you test eyewitness evidence? It's called corroboration. So the question is, the Gospels mention people and places and events. Do they turn out to be correct if you can independently verify it? Blomberg says yes. Now, he said the longer people explore this, the more details get confirmed. Archaeology has unearthed all sorts of discoveries that have confirmed all sorts of references in the Gospel, especially John, the one that they're often very suspicious of. I always think of, I'll just give one example myself. John said there were 4 or 5, I can't remember which, colonnades around the Pool of Bethesda, and nobody knew for hundreds and hundreds of years because Jerusalem had been trashed by the Romans, and they dug it up eventually, not all that long ago, and they found the exact correct number of pillars that were there. All right, here's the last test. Again, testing the eyewitness evidence. It's called the adverse witness. And then here's the question. Were others present who would have contradicted or corrected the Gospels if they were false? And Blomberg said, yeah, there were a lot of people that had reasons to discredit the movement. He said, yet look what his opponents did say. In later Jewish writings, Jesus is called a sorcerer. Well, notice what that says. That acknowledges he did some pretty miraculous things. So let's see, Strobel says, could this Christian movement have taken root right there in Jerusalem if people who knew him were aware that the disciples were exaggerating? I mean, think about that. The people that saw Jesus were later told by the Gospels, the disciples, all these things that Jesus had done, and if they're making it up or full of lies, those people would say, no, that's not what we saw, that's not what we heard. They could go to a tomb and pull out the body of Jesus. So these are 8 ways that you can test eyewitness evidence. So let's see, this is the end of the chapter. This is Blomberg talking. There are plenty of stories of scholars in the New Testament field who have not been Christians, yet through their study of these very issues, they've come to faith in Christ. And there have been countless more scholars, already believers, whose faith has been made stronger, more solid, more grounded because of the evidence. And Blomberg says that's the category I fall into. So I think that's a powerful chapter. It's, again, coming from The Case for Christ. Honest to goodness, that's a book that everybody ought to have on their shelf. And there are a lot of books that are out there floating around that you can pick up cheap in used bookstores. Well, thanks so much for being part of this. We'll do another podcast soon. Hope your day is going well.